We pray to God every single day for the speedy and peaceful dismantlement of the state of Israel. Then we can once again coexist as we have for hundreds of years. We have older rabbis who will testify lived in the old state of Jerusalem, in the old state, in the old city of Jerusalem, in the old city. They lived door by door. This rabbi lived in the old city of Jerusalem. Before 1948, he'll tell you how he lived, coexisted with all the Arab neighbors, how they babysat each other's children when they went to Yom Kippur, when the women went to Yom Kippur on the fast day, the Muslim neighbors babysat the children, the most precious objects they gave to them to protect. How could that be if they're our enemies, mortal enemies? Because they're not. It's not a religious conflict. That's a Zionist ploy of accusing everybody of being anti-Semitic. You want peace? You want to have a conference here of peace? Step back and look and read the facts. Not the facts that have been misconstrued by the Zionist propaganda. The facts that are realities. The facts on the ground. How we've been living for hundreds of years in Yemen, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Palestine, in Egypt. What Arab land have not Jewish people been living together with Muslims without any human rights groups? Tell me what land the Jews did not live in harmony with the Muslims. In Iran, we have over 25,000 Jews there, thank God. Why? Because this is not a religious conflict. It's purely because of a political movement, a relatively new movement, which is antithetical, contradictory to the Jewish religion of thousands of years. Judaism is spirituality, a religion of compassion to emulate God. Zionism has been created 100 years ago by atheists, people who have abhorred religion, who wanted to transform Judaism from religion to nationality, to a purely materialistic base, godless in its essence. That is not Judaism, and they have no right to use the name of Israel. They've usurped our name, they've stolen our symbols, and they've stolen our identity. And they are causing death and destruction, year in and year out. For over 50 years, death and bloodshed has not stopped because of a pure ideological belief called Zionism. They sacrifice on their idol bodies, human beings, hearts, souls. They rent, they've destructed houses, they've destructed people's lives. What can we do about this? Let's step back and think. There is a solution with God's help. If we would put away the politics, then we could know that we've been living and coexisting together. We most profusely apologize to the Muslims, to the Arabs, what has been done to them. And then we can return and make restitution for what has been done to them. And then we will be able to live in harmony. Not an Israeli state, but one Palestinian state. One state as we have been living for hundreds of years. There will be peace. And you will see that this 50 years has been a nightmare, a mirage, and nothing to do. Pure fear-mongering, that's what Zionism does. It's panic, going into a theater and yelling, fire, fire, that's what Zionists do. We've been living with the Muslims. We've been living, yes, Ahmadinejad keeps on stating that he does not want to harm the Jews, but the Zionists keep on antagonizing them. Of course you don't, because you have an agenda. You want to further Zionism. You want enemies. You want enemies in order to be able to say you're protecting the Jews. We don't want enemies. We want to live in peace. We have been always living in peace with the Muslims, and we will, with God's help, continue to live with them in peace. We implore the participants in this conference, read, step back, study the history truthfully, and see what the true Jewish voice is of hundreds of thousands of Jews who are still true to their religion, whether they're living in Jerusalem, whether they're living in New York. What do these Jews in Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, hundreds of thousands of Jews who are the most God-fearing in the community, why are they all opposed to the state of Israel? Why is that one Israeli flag in Williamsburg, Brooklyn? These are the most God-fearing religious Jews. Why don't they fly an Israeli flag? They have hospital help. They have Hatzolah, ambulatories, and everything free of charge to help people. The most greatest charitable organizations. Why these compassionate people don't support the state of Israel?
They don't go to Israel.
Why not?
Because they don't like Israel.
Why not? Because the self-hating Jews?
They're trying to build a Jewish state.
Why? Are they fools? Are they fools? The reason is simply because they fear God. And I know why. You don't know why, and I know why. Because they're God-fearing. And God forbid us to have a state. We are in exile by God. the decree exile. And we are forbidden to oppress the people. We are forbidden to oppress the Palestinian people and steal their houses. That is what Judaism says. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. We have no right to the rule over the land of Palestine. This is what Judaism says, not what these robbers say. It's what the real Jews say. This is what Zionists are doing. Beating Jews, beating Orthodox Jews. This is what you're having in Jerusalem. Look at our site, www.mkusa.org. They are beating mercilessly Orthodox Jews because they oppose Zionism. Pacifist Jews. Jews who never lifted an arm in their lives. They're put in jail. They're beat mercilessly. Look, this just came out last month. Look what they're doing to the Jewish people. This is what Zionism does to the Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem. This is ongoing. Look, know the truth of what Zionism is. Ridicule. That is what Zionism does. They ridicule and attack, but they hide the truth. We are divulging the truth. Look what's being done by the Zionist police to the Jewish people.
Ahmadinejad will kill you as well as everybody else.
This is Zionism. This is what Zionism does. This is what Zionism does. Peaceful, God-fearing Jews.
What is the penalty?
Destroying synagogues.
Destroying synagogues. It's death. Don't you understand? You're killing yourselves and all of us. What is the strength? What is the strength? Have you heard about Hitler? Anything about Hitler?
Look, these are the people of Jerusalem demonstrating against the state of Israel. This is the most God-fearing community. Scholars, the leaders of Jerusalem. Yes, where is your kippah? Why aren't you wearing a yarmulke? You know why? I'll tell you why. Because you have a false Judaism. We have the true Judaism.
Why do you live in America? Why do you live back to America? Why do you run so much?
Ridicule. But let's see you confront me with the facts. That you can't do. You can only ridicule, but you can't answer the facts. The facts you cannot confront. Hundreds of thousands of Jews still live in Jerusalem, and Beit Shemesh, and Bnei Brak, all opposed to the state of Israel, to the existence of the state of Israel. All of them plead with God every day for the speedy and peaceful dismantlement of the state. You won't find one truly religious community that supports in Zionism in its essence. Even the ones who are making different compromises don't send their children to the army. Why is that? Because Orthodox Jews know that Zionism is antithetical and contradictory to the Jewish religion. And they know that the death, suffering, is all caused by Zionism. There is no question about it. This is not a religious conflict. The true solution.
The history of the Jewish people goes back roughly 4,000 years. But in order to understand the desire by Jewish people in the late 1800s and early 1900s for a Jewish homeland, we have to go back roughly 17 or 1800 years to the year 135 in the Common Era. And it was then that Judea was a province of the Roman Empire. Judea is the biblical home of the Jewish people. It's the location of Jerusalem. And in 135 of the Common Era, the Roman Emperor Hadrian is able to suppress a rebellion by the Jews in Judea. And after suppressing that rebellion, he expels the Jews from Judea. So Hadrian expels the Jews from Judea. And it was actually, not only did he expel them from Judea, but he actually renamed the province. This province up here in red was Roman Syria. He merges these two provinces and calls them Syria Palestina. So let me write that down. So he renames it Syria Palestina, which is essentially why for the next 1,700 years or so, and even parts of it today, are referred to as Palestine. Now, we will fast forward over the next more than 1,700 years. So we're going to go more than 1,700 years. Over this period, most of the Jewish people are not now living in what was then Judea. They have settled in groups in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. There were even groups of Jews who had settled in India. And for the most part, they thrived in their various communities. But unfortunately, their history had a fairly large amount of persecution, of discrimination, of kind of using them as a scapegoat. This was particularly the case in Europe, where you have the Christian church often kind of blamed the Jews on religious grounds. You had, they were an easy scapegoat anytime things went hard. You had ethnic cleansing. You had pogroms. This was especially the Russian Empire, especially as we get into the 1800s, was especially infamous in its treatment of the Jews. And so you have this long history of Jewish persecution. In fact, much of Jewish tradition today is around remembrances of these various tragedies, these various persecutions. And so with that as the context, we then get into the late 1800s. And so let's go to 1860. 1860, you have the birth of Theodor Herzl. So 1860, you have the birth of this gentleman right over here, Theodor Herzl, born. And he's born to a German-speaking Jewish family in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the family he's born into isn't particularly religious. As a young man, he remains fairly secular. He's not a particularly religious person. But as he grows and he becomes a journalist, he's able to observe the anti-Semitism, especially that's occurring especially in the late 1800s in Russia, but throughout much of Europe. In 1894, so at this point he's 34 years old, still a fairly young man. In 1894 in Paris, he directly observes the Dreyfus affair, in which a French Jewish officer in the military is accused of treason, accused of spying for the Germans. This leads to all sorts of kind of public anti-Semitism. It later is shown that it was false claims on Dreyfus. And some people would debate whether this directly led to Theodor Herzl's articulation of a need for a Jewish homeland, but it was something that he directly observed, so it must have influenced him in some way. It was this and all of the other anti-Semitism that he observed either directly or indirectly his entire life, or even that he was able to read in the history books. And so taking all of that in, and this is coming from a fairly secular individual, in 1896, at the age of 36, he writes Der Judenstaat. Der Judenstaat, which literally translates as the Jewish state. Der Judenstaat. And this was a very articulate description or desire or articulation, I guess I should say, of the need for a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state. And so it's really the birth of political Zionism. Political Zionism. Now, where does the word Zionism come from? Well, the root is Zion, from Mount Zion. Mount Zion is essentially a hill in modern-day Jerusalem. But the word Zion is often equated with kind of with Jerusalem, with the Holy Land, with kind of the home of the Jews. And that would be roughly right over here. Jerusalem is roughly right over here. And I stress the modifier political Zionism is because there was already a movement to bring the Jewish people back to their ancient homeland in Judea, which could be referred to as Zionism. But it was really Herzl who articulated a need to set up a political state and start to organize around trying to create a political state. And I write over here, I quote some of what he wrote in Der Judenstaat. We are people, one people. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted us. In vain we are loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Palestine is our unforgettable homeland. And this ends up getting huge traction, resonates with the Jewish diaspora, gives him the power to essentially the next year organize in 1897 the first Zionist Congress. The first Zionist Congress, where he's able to bring together like-minded, or at least people who are looking to organize a way to eventually establish a Jewish state, preferably in Palestine. And I say preferably in Palestine, and it's clear that this was the first choice, to go back to the historical homeland of Judea. But even Herzl himself had considered Argentina, which at the time was very open-minded, very open towards immigration. There was some talk of East Africa, of British East Africa. In fact, the British offered Uganda in 1903 to what would later be called the Zionist Organization. It was considered at, I believe it was the 6th Zionist Congress. So these were things that were actually considered. But Palestine was always, because of historical reasons, the hopeful home of the Zionist movement. Now, I fully realize that this is an incredibly touchy issue, regardless of where people end on kind of their views of Zionism or of Theodor Herzl. Some would view him as a visionary, view him as a hero. Some would view him as starting the seed that led to the eventual, the occupation of Palestine and the settlements that are going on there. And I will try my best to stay out of kind of picking sides there. But regardless of where you are in that argument, it's pretty amazing how much foresight he actually had and his ability to kind of get this thing going. Even from the get-go, he had some conversations with the Ottomans and other folks about being able to get land in Palestine and all the rest. He wasn't successful in his own lifetime. But even after that first Zionist Congress, which was held in Basel, he understood what he was doing, and he was looking past beyond his own lifetime. And this is a quote here from his journal, and it's pretty telling. Were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it. And this is amazingly prescient, because the state of Israel would come into a reality in roughly 50 years. With that said, once again, I know this is an incredibly touchy issue. The one thing that is probably surprising to many people is that he was not a kind of an extreme individual, and it comes out from some of his other writing that even though he wanted this Jewish state, he was a fairly tolerant individual, and he did not view this only for the Jews, and he didn't feel that it should be taken by force or in any other way. And it comes out in his writing right over here. This is from his diary. It goes without saying that we shall respectfully tolerate persons of other faiths and protect their property, their honor, and their freedom with the harshest means of coercion. So protect their property, honor, and using the harshest means of coercion to protect their property, their honor, and their freedom. So this is a tolerant thing to do. This is another area in which we shall set the entire world a wonderful example. Should there be many such immovable owners in individual areas who will not sell their property to us, so say if we want to go there and properly buy land, but people don't want to sell it to us, we shall simply leave them there and develop our commerce in the direction of other areas which belong to us. So he wasn't in the mood to really get into a confrontation or to antagonize anyone. And he recognized that there were other people there that might not want to sell their land to those that might settle this new state. And later on in his life, right, actually shortly before his death, he actually writes a novel about this potential state that might be created. And he writes, this is written in Alt New Land. It literally translates to the Old New Land. It is founded on the ideas which are a common product of all civilized nations. It would be immoral if we would exclude anyone, whatever his origin, his descent, or his religion, from participating in our achievements, for we stand on the shoulders of other civilized peoples. What we own, we owe to the preparatory work of other peoples. Therefore, we have to repay our debt. There's only one way to do it, the highest tolerance. Our motto must therefore be, now and ever, man, you are my brother.
Live on Channel 5, this is the 10 o'clock news with Deborah Norville.
Coming out revealing secret negotiation between the Nazis and the Zionists in 1933 which allowed German Jews and their assets to go to Palestine. Rich Samuels joins us tonight with the story of the controversy behind the book and the author's struggle to write it. Rich?
Deborah, with the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in the spring of 1933, the Jews of the world were faced with a dilemma. They could raise a cry of protest, a cry few would heed, or they could make a deal with Hitler, a deal that would bring a step closer their dream of an independent Jewish state. The choice they made was difficult and agonizing. This new book describes that choice. The book is called The Transfer Agreement. This is Israel a few days ago, the season of Passover. And this is Germany 51 years ago, the blossoming of Adolf Hitler's springtime. A key factor in the vitality of today's Israel, the book's author argues, was an agreement reached in 1933 between a group of Zionists and the man who would later try to kill every living Jew.
The great irony is that Adolf Hitler became the chief economic sponsor of the State of Israel.
It will be an argument against, and a wrong argument against Zionists.
Some who lived through those times fear the response to this book. The parents of the author feared its very writing.
When your son came to you and said he was going to write this book, what were your feelings about his undertaking?
I told him he's not my son anymore.
Why did you say that?
I told him I'm going to sit shitty.
As though he were dead?
That's right.
I told him I don't like it. Because as being a Jew, I didn't want something to uncover on my own people.
I was buried in a grave with only 7 people. I was 7 times captured.
Edwin Black's parents are Holocaust survivors.
For what?
My parents never talked much about the Holocaust.
Edwin Black, to fill the void left by the silence of his parents, has written this book, a dense, detailed chronicle of the early months of 1933. January 30th, 1933. Hitler becomes Germany's interim chancellor. The Third Reich has begun. But in this country, on March 4th, attention is diverted by the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But ominous headlines tell what's already happening to the Jews of Germany. The protest of American Jews was heard almost immediately. It was based on only the sparsest of press reports, and nowhere was that protest more vocal than here in New York City.
All creeds, local and national organizations, and labor parties are joined in this gigantic demonstration passing through famous Washington Arch. Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, honorary president of the American Jewish Congress, leads the procession down Fifth Avenue on foot.
Father arranged for the first great mass meeting at Madison Square Garden to protest Hitlerism. He felt that when freedom was threatened, silence condoned oppression always.
Thousands who waited hours behind police lines rush forward as the doors of Madison Square Garden are open. Jews and Gentiles join in the race for seats, and 22,000 of them get in.
I was a young kid then, you see, as a teenager. And I belonged to a Zionist youth group. And we were all summoned to go to that rally. Well, it was a very agitated crowd. Many Yiddish speaking, a few English speaking. Rabbi Wise mounted an appeal to the Jewish people to do something to save Jewish honor.
Most of the important, well-established Jews were very angry at him, said this was sensationalism, and that if anything happened to the Jews in Germany, the blood of the Jews would be on his head.
Dr. Stephen S. Wise, rabbi of the Free Synagogue and a national leader of liberal thought, speaks in behalf of the Jews of the United States.
This is not a Jewish meeting. This is the conscience of America making itself felt.
The conscience of Nazi Germany made itself felt 5 days later. A Across the Reich, Hitler's troops shut down Jewish-owned businesses for 24 hours. Within days, American Jews marched calling for the boycott of all German exports. Jews throughout Europe echoed that call, so did Jews everywhere. But a group of Zionists at the same time was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine. And many new professions were introduced by them into the country, and they played a leading role in making Palestine then a more advanced and progressive country.
Israel is really what it is because of the foundation laid by the Eastern European group, and then the lift toward an educated and well-organized government that came with the immigration of the German Jewish group.
German Jewish settlement of Palestine was, for a time, official Nazi policy. These photos of Jewish life in Palestine, along with a lengthy text, appeared in 1934 in the Berlin paper Der Angriff. The publisher, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. A Nazi Visits Palestine was the title of the multi-part series. A medal was struck by Goebbels in commemoration. On one side, the swastika. On the other, the Star of David. Hitler demanded one concession for the transfer agreement, that the call for a boycott of the Reich, raised by Jews here and elsewhere, be rejected by the Zionists. The Zionists made that concession. And so, while Nazis were marching in Germany, and while Jews were marching here, diplomacy was running a more important story. In the Mediterranean, where the dream of a nation-state for Jewish people came a step closer to reality. The story in this book some will find hard to accept.
I still feel the hurt, but after I read it, I said, I'm all with you. Go ahead and write it.
Because everything was exactly what happened, and that's the truth, and you cannot deny it. And the truth must prevail.
And I'm not worried by the people who will find the book in bad taste. The smart people, the intelligent people, the people who went through will understand.
The author is torn between two profound feelings. That he has to be for a Jewish state, and that the silence which his parents have kept, well, he has to retaliate against that silence, and he takes it out on others.
It was a quest. It took me around the world. Financially, it depleted me. Emotionally, it drained me. And as far as my being a Jewish person and understanding my Jewish identity and my relationship to Israel and the Holocaust, it has fulfilled me. It has given me identity.
That he tries to exorcise his own demons by creating ghosts to visit the nights of others is really a very personal drama. And my only hope is that he will not damage the people, the state, and the brethren and sisters whom he proclaims to cherish.
Did you find what you wanted to know?
Yes, I know what happened, and I know why.
The transfer agreement will be available shortly. Macmillan is the publisher. Deborah?
Thanks, Rich. Really interesting.
And we're here today because we oppose Israel's assault on Gaza. Israel doesn't need more bombs and more money for weapons to defend itself. What Israel needs to do is it needs to stop its stranglehold on Gaza and its occupation and displacement of the Palestinian people.
If you have fears about what it might mean for you to be here, I understand that. If you are afraid about what you might lose in Jewish community or in your work or in your family, I understand that, and what I say to you is know that you are not alone, and so many of us here have been through that same experience, myself included, and you are not alone.
Well, there are more and more Jews, more and more American Jews who stand up against Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people. As you can see here, there are many people, more and more people who no longer support Israeli apartheid, and not just American Jews. I am an Israeli Jew, and I think that like seeing the Jewish people in general as a monolith, like associating between Jewish and Zionist as if it is the same thing, is buying into Israeli propaganda.